Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 117 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. If you are a loyal listener to the show, you know that we are all about growth and development. Indeed, if you recall how this podcast started, I highlighted a mock caseload of fictitious felons, if you will, to help me illustrate some of the core correctional skills and evidence-based practices which we are all about sharing on the show. I always believed, as a trainer and educator and now podcast producer, that it helps stick the landing a bit more if I can share concrete illustrations on top of the content being delivered. And so today, I thought I would channel a bit more of that philosophy and get back to those roots of using case studies to help connect the dots. You are all about to hear from friend of the podcast, Dr. Jerrod Brown, who is here today to talk about the fascinating topic of familicide, actually kicking off a series looking at that topic. And to help augment the interview today, I thought it might help to showcase a particular case file. To that end, as Dr. Brown is sharing his expertise with us on this topic, I will be dropping in nuggets of information around John Emil List, who, as I unravel this case for you, many of you may recognize this case. He was profiled on America's Most Wanted. That's when I first came across the case. But again, I think it'll really give some valuable context to this program today. And so, with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerrod Brown back to the Criminologist podcast. Welcome back to the show, Jerrod. You are no stranger to the podcast, but nonetheless, why don't we kick this off for first-time listeners and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then feel free to take it away with this fascinating topic today of familicide.
You bet. Thank you, Joe, for having me back, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in for the podcast. And my name's Jerrod, and I am a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant, and do a lot of work in the area of trauma, special needs populations, and domestic violence, and child abuse. And for today's topic, we're going to talk about familicide. And I believe, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, we're looking at maybe doing a series of recordings that focus on different dimensions of family homicide. This is one of the typologies that falls under the umbrella of really intra-familia homicide, depending on how you want to say it, or domestic homicide, family homicide. But if your audience isn't familiar with the topic of familicide, it really is a multiple victim type of homicide event where in most cases, it's not 100%, but the overwhelming majority of perpetrators in these cases is going to be the male. There are some documented cases where the female does it. We're going to really look at it through the lens as the male being the perpetrator and the female being the victim. But familicide is unfortunately taking that a step further, where the spouse or the ex-spouse, the male, would murder the female and one or more of the children in the house. And these, in some cases, depending on the research literature that you look at, familicide is sometimes used interchangeably in the research literature with something called family annihilators, and that might be another one we could do. Sometimes it's a little different, but family annihilators are typically going to be individuals, males in most cases, that go in and unfortunately murder the entire family, murder all the kids in the house and the other spouse or the ex. Murder-suicide in these cases is not uncommon. It doesn't happen in 100% of the cases, but a good chunk of these cases, the perpetrator, after they commit these heinous acts, in some cases may kill themselves as well. So we definitely want to be aware of that dynamic, which we'll talk about. But breaking this down, it's a tough topic. It's an important topic to me because I've done a lot of work in the area of domestic violence. I've worked with many, many survivors of domestic violence, but I've also worked with quite a few perpetrators of domestic violence. And I've actually written a good handful of just shorter practitioner-friendly articles on different aspects of family homicide. And if your audience just Googles my name and types that in, you should be able to find them online. And through APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, the organization I founded in 2011, we've actually offered a good handful of trainings over the years on different dimensions of family homicide, where I've either helped develop those trainings with the trainers or just provided a lot of guidance. And I'm doing actually more consultation around some of these topics now as well. So it's a really important topic. We're going to talk about why it's important. Thankfully, it's rare, but it's complex. And it's one of the most difficult crimes, I think, for people to understand. How could someone go murder their family members, especially their children and their wife? It's poorly understood. Now, there's a good there's quite a few articles that have been published on the topic, Joe, but if we compare this to other crimes, it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, there's just not a lot. So there's ample opportunity for researchers to dig deeper into this topic. It gets confusing, too, because depending on the study you look at and depending on where the study came out of, if it's overseas or if it's the United States, you might have some different definitional inconsistencies. And when that happens, that can get tricky too in some cases. So it is a type of mass murder, but it's a type of mass murder that happens within the family context. And in a lot of cases, like everyone's seen these cases on TV. They get huge media attention. Thankfully, again, they're rare, but when they do happen, it can damage communities for generations. It gets widespread media attention. In a lot of cases, you'll see, like when they interview neighbors of the family, you hear so often, they seem like a nice family. I'm shocked. I never saw any warning signs. Well, the research also says in some cases, there might not be any outward signs. But as you dig deeper in this literature, there's a lot of dynamics, a lot of moving parts. It's not just one thing to consider. Now, future podcasts, Joe, depending on how far we want to go with this, familicide is one type of family homicide, family murder, intrafamilial homicide. There's something called matricide. That's the killing of one's mother. There's patricide, the killing of one's father. There's something called siblicide, the killing of one's sibling. Fratricide, it falls under that umbrella where someone kills their brother, or soricide, someone kills their sister. There's many other dimensions. Filicide, parricide, infanticide, there's many different dimensions. Those are not all of them. But there's unique dimensions to them. There's unique profile characteristics. Sometimes there's different victim-offender characteristics. What happens if the female is the actual offender and the male's the victim? There's different gender considerations, too, that this research has really kind of highlighted and shown as well. So when we look at this through this lens, if we dig deep into this literature, there's usually the familicide offender, not all cases, but a lot of the cases, they have a long history of failure in their life and frustration. Maybe it's job loss, economic loss. They just feel like they're a failure. Maybe there's a high level of shame. They just feel worthless. They feel like they can't provide for their family anymore. over time, regardless of the individual, repeated frustrations, repeated feelings of being a failure, that can erode our ability to cope. So keep that in the back of your mind too. Coping skills might be really low among some of these individuals. Again, lots of dynamics. And over time, some case studies really point to the fact that some of these factors could be a triggering event where even like the modest disappointment can seem catastrophic to that individual, and their mind really just blows it out of proportion. Now, again, most people who have these things in their history and experience these things never commit these acts. Again, it's rare, thankfully. Joe, before I talk about some of the specific variables that show up in this literature, any thoughts or comments?
Lots of thoughts, lots of comments. As you know, Jerrod, I am a big assessment guy. Is there such a thing as a profile of this type of offender typology, if you will?
Every case is different. We need to take that into account. A lot of moving parts, gender considerations, cultural considerations, age considerations. Those are just a few. But if you were to look at pretty much most, I've gone through as many studies as I can on this topic. I'm not saying I've read everything, but I've gone through everything I could find over the years. The things that pop up in these studies: psychological instability. Not all of these offenders have diagnosed mental health problems, but a lot do. So we want to look at, is there a history of psychological instability? There is some evidence, again, not all, but some may have higher incidence of different types of personality-based disorder traits. Depression. Was there a history of depression as well? We know most people, obviously, with depression are law-abiding citizens. But again, there's lots of variables to take into account. So we need to take that. Substance misuse. Is there a history of drug or alcohol problems or any other types of substances that could impair judgment? Maybe the person was dealing with some physical health issues as well. So taking that into account. Is there any medical issues? Do they have a history of any type of other violent or risk-taking behaviors? So any previous convictions of domestic violence, child abuse, maybe it's road rage. Just looking at the big picture, are there other risk-taking behaviors and violent tendencies this person has dealt with in their life? Any history of suicidal thinking? Impulsivity has been brought up in this literature. There's a couple case studies that talk about pathological gambling as well. Did the person have a pathological gambling problem and lost all of their money and now is just in complete disarray, in shock, in depression, and they just don't know what to do? Again, overwhelming majority of people with addiction issues never do this, but it's a factor to consider in some of these cases. Rumination. Again, maybe it's perseveration, maybe it's anger rumination. So those problematic thinking, looking at histories of financial worry. Divorce could be a triggering factor, or the threat of divorce. Unfortunately, in some of these cases, that threat of divorce or the mom leaving and there's child custody issues and the dad loses children, in some cases, that has been a triggering event. Again, most people who go through a high conflict divorce or lose their children don't do this behavior, but it's something to take into account. Paranoia, histories of extreme jealousy or perceived jealousy where the individual thinks that the other person is cheating on them, even though maybe they're not, but they got in their mind that the person is cheating on them. Shame. Maybe they had like social decline where they lost their job. They feel like they're a social outcast now. They've lost their friend network. They isolate. There are high levels of loneliness, those kind of things. Maybe it's possessive tendencies as well. So really looking at that through the lens of like coercive control. intimate partner violence. In a future podcast, I think it'd be great to do just a general one on intimate partner violence, and then what are the factors that could bring some people to this level of behavior, unfortunately. That lack of sense of belonging is something to take into account. Loss of jobs, revenge in some cases has been a motivator, where maybe the spouse left, took the children, and then revenge sets in the other spouse or the ex. So revenge has been a documented kind of variable in some of these cases. So those are just a few of the variables that come up in the research literature. So a lot of times, like, people want to know, like, how common is this? How often does it happen? I am aware of at least one study that indicates that the rates of familicide are around 1 to 2 familicides per every 10 million people in the population. Very rare, but 1 is too many. So it happens. What is going on now in our society with, like, all the stress and COVID? What we do know is there have been tons of studies that have shown that COVID-related stress around the world has been an amplifier for domestic violence. Most incidents of domestic violence do not reach this level, but we need to look at any kind of stress that is going on, again, in this family. If you dig into this literature too, some researchers have also looked at, like, what are the different methods in which the family annihilator actually murders family. And I don't want to go too deep in the weeds with this, but there are definitely different studies that have looked at the various methods used in some of these cases. Obviously, shooting, stabbings. There's been case studies on carbon monoxide poisoning through car exhaust. Strangulation. I actually gave a talk a handful of years ago on domestic violence, TBI, and strangulation. So we really need to be aware of the topic of strangulation, which is actually a huge risk factor for, basically, if someone is in a relationship, domestic violence, and they're strangled, the risk of future death increases significantly compared to the general population when strangulation is introduced into the equation. Jumping from a cliff, pushing a family member off a cliff, that's been documented. Suffocation, drowning, lots of different methods, obviously.
John List was born in 1925 in Bay City, Michigan. Like his father, List was a devout Lutheran and a Sunday school teacher. The year before his father's death in 1944, John List graduated from Bay City Central High School. In 1943, he enlisted in the United States Army and served as a laboratory technician during World War II. After his military discharge in 1946, List enrolled at the University of Michigan, where he earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in accounting. In November of 1950, as the Korean War escalated, List was recalled to active military service. While serving at a base in Virginia, he met Helen Morris Taylor, who he married in 1951. After completion of his second tour in 1952, John List worked for an accounting firm in Detroit and then as an audit supervisor at a paper company in Kalamazoo, where his 3 children were born. By 1959, List had risen to general supervisor of the company's accounting department, but his wife Helen, an alcoholic, had become increasingly unstable. In 1960, John moved the family to Rochester, New York, to take a job with Xerox. There, he eventually became director of accounting services, and in 1965, John List accepted a position as vice president and comptroller at a bank in New Jersey. At that time, he moved his wife and children, as well as his mother, into Breeze Knoll, a 19-room Victorian mansion. Jerrod, although these cases are extremely rare, in your research, have you been able to determine anything along the lines of, say, a triggering event which may precipitate these tragedies?
I don't feel confident saying what it is. It's different for everyone. There are triggering events where it was rage control issues, revenge, jealousy, thinking that they're doing it to save their family from embarrassment and shame as well. In their mind, in some cases, they're thinking they're doing it for the right reasons. There have been some offenders that have done this out of delusional or psychotic beliefs where they've heard voices, where the voices have been told to do this to the individual. So there's different dimensions of this. There's different profiles you'll find. If you look at some of this older literature, I think even going back to the mid-70s, there's an author by the name of Fraser that talked about two different kind of filicide profiles. There's a murder by proxy type of offender and a suicide by proxy offender. So the murder by proxy offender, they're typically in those cases, at least from this early research, the offender was estranged from the spouse. Maybe they were divorced or they were separated. With that murder by proxy offender as well, they really viewed that spouse or ex-spouse and the children as an enemy. They did not see them as an ally, so they saw them as an enemy. So that is something definitely to be aware of as well. And by killing the family members, they did it out of rage or malice. So that's the murder one. The suicide by proxy offender, higher levels of depression, feeling more worthless, high levels of shame, lots of financial issues. And this type of offender did it out of a way, in their mind at least, they're saving their family from so much turmoil. So those are some earlier profiles. Since that time, there's been other profiles that have broken it down even more, where there's another author that looked at it different lenses of 4 different profiles, where there was one particular offender was obsessed with kind of confirming that spouse was cheating on them. So there's this really an obsessive component. Some of the times too, they may have lost that ability to just handle their life circumstances, and they're dealt with so much rage and anger control issues. In other cases, they were just dealt with such an overwhelming sense of guilt. So a lot of different dimensions of this. And another dimension too, the individual might have had like psychotic delusions or something like that. So again, that's not an exhaustive list of the different profiles, but as you can just hear from these different profiles, there's different dimensions. It's not always the same type of offender. Some offenders do it to go live another life, like you mentioned the case. Others do it and they end up killing themselves after the event. So lots of motivation. But looking at this through a trauma lens, there have been a few studies that have looked at this through a trauma lens through the offender. And I wouldn't say the overwhelming majority of these offenders have had trauma histories, at least from the research, but a sizable minority of them had some trauma in their history. So what kind of trauma did they deal with in childhood? And again, most people with trauma histories, even most people with extensive trauma, some of the worst traumas you ever heard of, never go on to do this. Why do some people go on to do this? Again, multitude of reasons and factors, moving parts. And when we think of this too through a domestic violence lens, obviously domestic violence, we need to be aware of that. But if we look at the histories of familicide offenders, not all of these offenders have committed domestic homicide or domestic violence prior to this. Some research I've seen has pointed it around 25%, 50%. It depends on the study, but there's still a good chunk of these offenders that have never had contact with the criminal justice system or have never engaged in domestic violence as well. Some of the risk factors that come up in this research that if the person has had a domestic violence history perpetration, what are some other risk factors that in some cases could increase the risk of filicide or familicide? Having access to a firearm has been shown to be a risk factor in some of these cases. Previous violent threats. So looking at history, again, a lot, looking at like some of the domestic violence risk assessment tools, again, looking at history. History is a good predictor of the future, not 100% of the time. Choking, strangulation history obviously needs to be taken into account. Extreme jealousy. We need to be aware of extreme jealousy and in some cases, extreme depression. Now, again, all of these factors may come together at the same time and reach kind of that perfect storm. But again, what is that triggering event? Why is somebody that's dealt with all of these issues in the past never go on to commit these, and then someone else deals with these issues and goes on to commit that? I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is there's usually a lot of layers to this that we need to take into account, and hopefully we're pointing out just a few of these. So what happens if, too, in some cases, the perpetrator kills the spouse or ex-spouse and one or more children? But what happens if one or more children weren't in the house at that time and actually survived? There's a lot of evidence, too, that has looked at survivors of these kind of crimes, too. And you can about imagine the impact this has on surviving children of domestic homicide. They typically go through life, not 100% of the time. They're going to have more psychiatric issues, more physical health problems. They may have trust issues. They may be more anxious. So really considering this through a victim lens too, victimology lens, understanding the impact this has on the surviving family members, extended family, and the community as a whole, we need to come around the survivors here too and provide them the support and services to help them get through this horrific tragedy and horrific trauma as well.
On November 9th, 1971, John List murdered his entire immediate family using his own 9mm semi-automatic handgun and his father's Colt .22 caliber revolver. While his children were at school, he shot his wife Helen, 46, in the back of the head, and then his mother Alma, 84, above her left eye. As his daughter Patricia, 16, and younger son Frederick, 13, arrived home from school, List shot each of them in the back of the head. After making himself lunch, List drove to his bank to close both his and his mother's bank accounts, and then to Westfield High School to watch his elder son John Frederick, 15, play in a soccer game. After driving John Frederick home, John List shot him repeatedly because, as misfire evidence showed, his son attempted to defend himself. List placed the bodies of his wife and children on sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom. He left his mother's body in her apartment in the attic. In a 5-page letter to his pastor, found on the desk in his study, List claimed that he saw too much evil in the world, and he had killed his family to save their souls. He then cleaned the various crime scenes, removed his own picture from all family photographs in the house, turned the radio to a religious station, and departed. The murders were not discovered until December 7th, nearly a month later, due in part to the family's reclusive tendencies, and in part to the notes sent by List to the children's schools and part-time jobs claiming that the children would be visiting their ailing maternal grandmother in North Carolina for a few weeks. List also stopped milk, mail, and newspaper deliveries. Neighbors noticed that all of the mansion's rooms were illuminated day and night, with no apparent activity within the house. After light bulbs began burning out one by one, neighbors called the police. Officers entered through an unlocked window leading to the basement and discovered the family's bodies. Westfield, where few violent crimes had been recorded since 1963, received national attention as the site of one of the most notorious felonies in New Jersey since the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby. A nationwide manhunt was launched. Police investigated hundreds of leads without success. All reliable photographs of John List had been destroyed. The family car was found parked at JFK Airport in New York City, but police found no evidence that List boarded a flight. Jerrod, again, I really appreciate your subject matter expertise on this topic and the research you've done around this offender typology. Any other things you can share as far as characteristics, demographics, or other themes maybe that your research has uncovered?
You bet. Again, not a ton of studies on this. Some of the studies, small case studies, some of the studies are older, so take this with a grain of salt. But some research has found that a high percentage of Familicide victims were victimized in their own bedrooms, and the majority of these kind of cases took place in middle-class suburban communities. Some research has found that to be more common, but again, it's never going to be 100%. If we look at some of the offenders, the men who have committed these crimes, some research has also found, looking at these case studies, that the offender age was around 35 to 43 years of age. Again, sometimes there's outliers, but most of the cases that some of these researchers have looked at fell into that category as well. Some of these individuals also had some mental health problems. Again, not all, but some of the more common mental health issues when they were present that came up in some of these studies: higher incidence of substance abuse disorders, psychosis or paranoia, obsessive behaviors, depression, and personality disorders were some of the more common ones noted in some of these studies. And again, when we think about the history of these offenders in terms of committing previous acts of domestic violence on the spouse or ex-spouse, the studies really vary depending on what study. But the studies I've looked at, anywhere from 39% to 92% depending on the sample. So again, depending on the study, some studies found that only 39% had a history of domestic violence before these acts were carried out, unfortunately. So those were just a few things to take into account. But for like future podcasts, Joe, I know we were talking about maybe doing a few, but we definitely look at intimate partner violence in general, and even through the era of COVID-19, but also talking about just intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide. What are the dynamics of that too? Let's say when we're looking at intimate partner homicide, how does that differ from what we're talking about today? Intimate partner homicide would be when, in most cases, the wife or the ex or the girlfriend was murdered, but the children were not. What are the different dynamics there? That might be something worth looking into. And then also there's a number of different intimate partner violence risk assessment tools that are out there. Lots of different ones. So obviously early intervention is key, and prevention of these crimes is necessary. And again, sometimes there are just lots of risk factors that are obvious. For some of these cases, again, very few risk factors, very difficult to tell on face value what's going on. But just having your audience become more familiar with some of the different risk assessment tools out there, and even some prevention strategies and intervention, might be very helpful to take into account.
In 1971, as the FBI later discovered, John List had traveled by train from New Jersey to Michigan and then to Colorado. He settled in Denver in early 1972 and took an accounting job under the name Robert Peter Clark. List joined a Lutheran congregation and even ran a carpool for shut-in church members. At one religious gathering, he met Dolores Miller, and they were married in 1985. In 1989, the then 18-year-old crime was recounted on the television program America's Most Wanted. The segment featured an age-progressed clay bust which turned out to bear a close resemblance to John List's actual appearance. Less than 2 weeks after the broadcast, List was arrested after a neighbor recognized the description and alerted authorities. At his trial, List testified that his financial difficulties reached crisis level in 1971 when he was laid off with the closure of the Jersey City Bank. To avoid sharing this humiliating development with his family, List engaged in the same routine and dress as when employed, leaving home each morning on schedule and spending the day at job interviews or at the Westfield train station, reading newspapers until it was time to come home. List diverted money from his mother's bank accounts to avoid default on his mortgage. As the year progressed, the family's financial problems became more strained. List encouraged his children to seek part-time work, ostensibly to teach them maturity and responsibility, but in actuality, to help keep the family financially solvent. A court-appointed psychiatrist testified that List suffered from obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, and that he saw only two solutions to his situation: accept welfare or kill his family and send their souls to heaven. Welfare was an unacceptable option, he reasoned, because it would expose him and his family to ridicule and violate his authoritarian father's teaching regarding the care and protection of family members. On April 12, 1990, John List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing, he denied direct responsibility for his actions. Quote, "I feel that because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened." The judge, however, was unpersuaded. He imposed a sentence of 5 terms of life imprisonment to be served consecutively, the maximum permissible by penalty at the time. John List died of complications from pneumonia, aged 82, on March 21st, 2008. Jerrod, as you noted, these cases are extremely rare, but for the listener out there, particularly those working with justice-involved individuals, are there any takeaways that they could take from this episode as it relates to their day-to-day job function?
I would say, would since you're in probation, would you say most probation officers will work with a client who's had a history of domestic violence at some point, or a high percentage? It may not reach this level, but a high percentage have experienced or perpetrated domestic violence on some level?
I would say yes, Dr. Brown.
So just starting out with learning about domestic violence, family violence, the different dimensions, the risk factors, the warning signs. By just educating yourself, that's a good starting point. But then as we go deeper, obviously, what are those triggering factors? What separates someone who has perpetrated domestic violence repeatedly? But then what separates that person from a family homicide offender? A lot of different dynamics. Again, overwhelming majority of people who've committed even heinous acts of domestic violence do not go on to do this, thankfully. But again, one is too many. So my goal, I'm just trying to get the word out as much as possible, educate people, train, consult, and just give information to as many people who are interested in this topic as possible, because COVID-19 has amplified so many stressors for so many people. And there's just so much stress in our world today. Anything we can do to learn more about the different dynamics, community stressors, worry, fear, uncertainty, shame, jealousy, guilt, all of these things, I think will help us better understand, at least to some level, some of these relational dynamics that may go awry and unfortunately lead to some of these heinous crimes.
Jerrod Brown of Concordia University, also the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. Thank you so much for shedding some light on this topic for us, Jerrod, and we look forward to having you back on the show. Thank you so much, my friend.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Joe.
Always learn so much when Jerrod Brown is on the show. Jerrod, we're looking forward to your next visit, my friend. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Go ahead and give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is now available. Reach out if you'd like some swag. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
John List was a young, sweet accountant at a nearby bank who worked hard to support his family. He lived in a 19-room New Jersey estate with his mother, wife, and 3 children. Their house had a ballroom, marble fireplaces, and a Tiffany skylight. In 1971, 46-year-old John List lost his job at a bank and couldn't bear to tell his family about his financial downtown. After failed job searches, he would later say that he had only one option: murdering his family and disappearing forever.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.